The husband hired a maid who looked exactly like his wife, but the truth they discovered later turned their lives upside down. Subscribe and comment where you're watching this video from. The sun rose lazily over the suburban neighborhood, casting a warm golden hue across the pristine lawn of the Harwood residence. Inside the two-story colonial house at the end of Willow Court, the day was beginning like any other. The rhythmic clatter of cereal bowls, the chatter of two children arguing over who would sit by the window, and the low hum of classical music playing in the background set the tone of normalcy. At the head of the kitchen island, Naomi stirred a spoon through her coffee absent-mindedly, watching her children with the quiet pride only a mother could wear. Sophia, the elder of the two, with tightly coiled curls and her mother's expressive eyes, jabbed at her younger brother with a spoon. Miles, 6 years old and full of energy that even sleep couldn't fully subdue, retaliated with a grin and a handful of cereal. Their laughter echoed in the kitchen, bouncing off the white marble countertops and brushed brass fixtures. Naomi smiled, but her gaze drifted out the window to the garden beyond, where a storm of landscaping deadlines loomed like a gray cloud. James entered the kitchen in his usual composed manner, dressed impeccably in a navy suit despite the fact that he would be working from home that day. His tie was already knotted, and his polished shoes tapped lightly against the tile. He leaned in to kiss Naomi's cheek, who met his lips with a distracted smile. "Big week ahead," she murmured, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. He nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "The Linwood project?" She exhaled slowly. "Final presentations start next week. I'll be on site most of the time. I need someone in the house, just until things calm down." James glanced toward the children. "You mean like a nanny?" Naomi shook her head. "No, just someone to help with the housework. Cooking, cleaning, getting the kids from school if I'm running late. I've already vetted a few agencies." James looked skeptical for a moment, then relented. "All right. Just make sure they're thoroughly screened." "I will. This isn't the first time I've handled hiring someone." "Didn't mean it like that," he said gently. "I trust your judgment." By the following afternoon, Naomi had arranged everything. The agency she chose was reputable, exclusive, and claimed to only send candidates with clean backgrounds and years of experience. They would handle the background checks and references. All she needed to do was confirm the interview. The appointment was set for Thursday morning. Naomi barely gave it another thought, too consumed with floor plans and irrigation schedules to dwell on the logistics. Thursday came swiftly. The morning passed in a blur of email replies and last-minute lunchbox preparations. By the time the doorbell rang, Naomi was upstairs reviewing a sample contract. James, on a break between conference calls, moved to open the door, expecting a polite middle-aged woman in a uniform. Instead, he stood frozen. The woman on the doorstep smiled warmly, holding a modest duffel bag and a folder neatly labeled "Liam." She wore the standard domestic uniform, gray slacks, a fitted blouse, but it wasn't her outfit that unsettled him. It was her face. James blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. She looked exactly like Naomi. Not similar, not a little like her, exactly. The same almond-shaped eyes, the same rich brown skin with a honeyed undertone, the same slight tilt to her smile. Even the tiny beauty mark beneath her left eye, Naomi's mark, was there. His mind scrambled for logic. A prank? A doppelganger? Some elaborate mix-up? "Mr. Harwood," the woman said, her voice soft and familiar. He stepped back involuntarily. Yes, you must be..." "Leah?" "Leah," With Juana, her eyes darted past him into the house, and for a moment there was something unreadable in them, an alertness, a flicker of recognition that shouldn't have been there. Upstairs, Naomi heard the exchange and called down, "Is that the housekeeper?" James didn't respond. Naomi descended the stairs and stopped halfway as she caught sight of the figure standing at the threshold. The folder she had been holding slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a muffled slap. Her knees went weak, and she gripped the banister for support. She stared at the woman, this mirror version of herself with wide, unblinking eyes. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounded furiously. Sophia and Miles came running at the sound of the folder dropping, and when they saw the woman at the door, both children froze. Then, almost in unison, they exclaimed, "Mommy?" Leah flinched as if struck. Her hands gripped the folder tighter. "I think there's a mistake," she whispered. Naomi found her voice at last, though it trembled. "Who are you?" The woman looked between them, her face pale now. "I'm here for the housekeeping position. The agency sent me. My name is Leah Morris." James stepped aside, his brain telling him to shut the door and call the agency. But his instincts, something deeper, told him not to. Naomi slowly descended the rest of the stairs. Standing directly in front of the woman now, she could see every detail. Same nose, same cheekbones, same scar above the brow. Hers was from a childhood fall against a coffee table. Her mother used to say it gave her character. How could this woman have that scar? For a long, pregnant silence, no one spoke. Then James cleared his throat. "Come in, please." Naomi turned to him sharply, eyes wide with protest, but he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Just for a moment. We need answers." Leah stepped inside hesitantly, her footsteps silent on the polished hardwood floor. The children peered around the corner, whispering to each other. Sophia, ever the observer, seemed to sense the tension and took her brother's hand. Naomi sat down on the edge of the sofa, as though any sudden movement might shatter the illusion, or whatever this was. James offered Leah a chair, which she took, perching on the edge as if ready to flee. "The agency told me the family was looking for help with housework," Leah began. I didn't expect." She stopped, voice trembling. "Have you seen me before?" Naomi asked. "No," Leah said quickly. Too quickly. James looked between them. "You look exactly like her," he said quietly. "I know." They stared at each other, the air thick with disbelief. Naomi was no longer afraid. She was angry. Angry at the invasion, at the confusion, at the chaos rippling through her carefully structured world. James called the agency immediately after Leah was escorted to the guest room, still shaken. They confirmed her identity. Leah Morris, 29 years old, born and raised in Georgia, orphaned as an infant, raised by a widowed caregiver named Miss Evelyn. They had no record of her having any family. "No twin," the agent on the phone said. "She's been through standard checks. Her resemblance to your wife is, well, uncanny, but purely coincidental, I assure you." James didn't feel assured. That night, Naomi lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't stop thinking about Leah's face, about the scar, the birthmark, the way her smile curved just so, and her voice. It wasn't identical, but it had the same musical undertone. Coincidence didn't cover this. Coincidence didn't leave your children calling another woman Mommy. She rose before dawn, walked into the guest room, and watched Leah sleep. And for a moment, Naomi felt as though she were staring at herself from a life that had never been lived. As morning broke over the Harwood household, the air was different, tighter. The children were quieter, watching the adults for cues. James didn't make his usual coffee. Naomi didn't touch her toast. Leah emerged from the guest room looking exhausted, her eyes red, but she offered to help with breakfast anyway. Naomi didn't respond. She couldn't. The storm hadn't hit yet, but something deep inside Naomi whispered it was coming. The days that followed passed in a strange, fragile stillness. The Harwood household, once filled with rhythm and routine, now moved through each moment with an unnatural hesitation, like dancers unsure of the next step. Leah had been given the guest room on the second floor, down the hall from the children, but no one treated her quite like a guest, and certainly not like a maid. Naomi couldn't bring herself to assign her chores, and James made no mention of the arrangement at all. Leah drifted quietly through the house, offering help where she could, though her hands often paused in mid-action, as if unsure whether she was allowed to touch the space around her. Naomi watched her constantly, though not always openly. In stolen glances through mirrors, from the reflection in glass cabinets, or through the cracks of half-open doors. She memorized the way Leah turned her head when she was spoken to, how her eyebrows arched just a fraction before she answered a question, the way she leaned slightly forward when listening. These weren't just habits, they were her habits, the same gestures Naomi had seen in herself for years. And yet, it was more than mimicry. It was as though her very essence had been poured into another vessel. James was no less affected. Though he tried to maintain composure, Naomi noticed the subtle changes. He hesitated when he spoke to her, paused longer between sentences as if weighing his words more carefully. Sometimes, when he thought Naomi wasn't looking, she caught him staring at Leah, not with desire, but with a haunted curiosity that was beginning to wear on Naomi's nerves. The children were confused. Miles, young enough to be direct, asked one morning at breakfast if Leah was their mommy's sister. Naomi choked on her coffee. Sophia, ever the perceptive one, had grown quieter, withdrawn. She watched Leah with cautious eyes, as if trying to determine whether the world had suddenly broken into two halves. That evening, while James was upstairs on a video call and the children played in the den, Naomi found Leah folding laundry in the sunroom. The light filtered in through the gauzy curtains, casting a glow that made the room feel warmer than it was. Naomi stood silently in the doorway, arms crossed, unsure of what she'd come to say. Leah looked up and offered a tentative smile. "I thought I'd help with the kids' things. Hope that's all right." Naomi didn't answer. She walked into the room slowly, eyes fixed on the pile of neatly folded clothes, then at the woman folding them. Her mind was spinning with the questions she hadn't dared voice. Instead, she reached out, lifted a strand of Leah's hair, and examined it between her fingers. "It curls the same way," Naomi murmured. Leah's breath caught. She didn't move. "Did you notice?" Naomi asked. "That we moved the same way? That we have the same scar?" "I noticed," Leah whispered. "Where did you get it?" "I don't know. I've had it as long as I can remember. Miss Evelyn used to call it my moonline." Naomi exhaled sharply, something between a laugh and a sob. "My mother said the same thing." The room fell into silence again, heavy and breathless. Later that night, Naomi lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling once more. James had turned in early, exhausted from back-to-back meetings, and now lay curled beside her, breathing softly. She watched the ceiling fan spin, the blades whispering secrets in the dark. Then, unable to bear the weight of stillness, she rose, wrapped herself in a robe, and slipped into the study. She opened the drawers of her mother's old chest, the one she'd kept for sentiment rather than use. She sifted through photographs, birth certificates, old holiday cards, anything that might hold a clue. Then she found it. A photograph from her infancy. She was wrapped in a pink blanket, held by a dark-skinned woman with weary eyes and a bright head wrap. On the back, in faint ink, were the words, "My beautiful girl, A." Naomi frowned. Just the letter A, not Naomi, not my Naomi, just A. Her mother had never called her that. It felt formal, cold, as if meant for a stranger. She dug further, finding a yellowing envelope with the hospital's logo printed faintly across the top. Inside was a copy of her birth record. Her eyes scanned the details: date, time, weight, mother's name, and then a line that made her heart stop. Delivery type, cesarean, twin, baby A, baby B. Naomi sat back, the paper trembling in her hands. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. This couldn't be. She had always been told she was an only child. Her mother had said it often, almost defensively, as if justifying the closeness of their bond. There had never been any mention of a sibling. No stories, no memories, no photos. She rushed to her phone, dialing a number she hadn't used in months. It rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. "Aunt Cecilia? Naomi?" The older woman sounded confused. "Is everything all right?" "I need to ask you something," Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I was born, was I alone?" There was a long pause. Too long. "What kind of question is that at this hour? Please, it's important. Were there 2 babies?" Aunt Cecilia sighed. "Your mother was very private about that time, but I remember. She was in the hospital longer than expected, and I heard rumors, the kind of things no one talks about. She nearly died, you know, lost too much blood, and someone whispered that there was another baby, but the baby didn't make it." Naomi's grip tightened on the phone. "Are you sure? Did anyone ever confirm that?" "No, and I stopped asking. Your mother got angry whenever I brought it up, said it was just gossip." Naomi ended the call with a hollow thank you. Her legs felt unsteady as she stood. She walked to the mirror over the fireplace and stared at her reflection. Except it wasn't just her reflection anymore. She was beginning to see 2 faces where once there had only been one. The next morning, she told James she needed a day off from everything. From work, from planning, from pretending this wasn't unraveling their lives. He nodded without question, pressing a kiss to her temple and watching her leave with concern he didn't voice. Naomi drove without music, her hands clenched tightly on the wheel. She visited the town's library, then the county records office. Her own birth had been registered, but there was no corresponding certificate for a second child. It was as if baby B had never existed. She returned home exhausted, only to find Leah sitting with the children on the porch, reading aloud from a book Naomi used to love as a girl. The scene struck her like a blow to the chest. Miles was leaning against Leah's side. Sophia was resting her head on her shoulder. They looked like family. That night, while the children slept, Naomi sat across from Leah at the kitchen table. They didn't speak at first. The silence hung heavy between them, filled with questions too big for words. Finally, Naomi said, "Do you remember anything? From before Miss Evelyn?" Leah shook her head. "I was told I was left at the hospital. No records, no visitors, no name. Just a note that said Grace. Miss Evelyn changed it to Leah when she adopted me." Naomi's breath hitched. "Grace, that was my grandmother's name." Leah's eyes widened. For a moment, neither moved. "Why now?" Naomi whispered. "Why did you come to this house?" "I didn't know," Leah said. "I was just taking a job. The agency sent me. But when I saw you—" She couldn't finish. Naomi stood, walked around the table, and gently lifted the back of Leah's shirt. There, on her upper left back, was the same crescent-shaped birthmark Naomi had hidden her whole life, the one her mother had called her secret signature from God. She touched it lightly. Mine's the same. Leah turned slowly, tears in her eyes. Naomi saw herself mirrored in that gaze, not just the shape, but the soul, the loss, the yearning, the pieces that had been missing without either of them knowing it. And for the first time, Naomi no longer felt afraid. She felt the beginning of something she couldn't yet name, something deeper than shock, something older than doubt, a truth that had been waiting all these years to find its way home. The discovery of the birthmark changed everything. What had once been an uneasy coincidence was now a tangible connection. It wasn't just the face or the voice anymore. It was the mark, an identical, oddly shaped crescent that Naomi had always believed made her different. Now that mark, which her mother had once called a gift from the ancestors, existed on another woman's back. A woman who had walked through their front door as a stranger, but who now stood as a reflection of Naomi herself. Naomi didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring into the dark, her mind racing with half-formed questions and memories. James lay beside her, but she couldn't bring herself to speak to him yet. How could she, when she herself didn't fully understand what she was thinking? The silence in the room was no longer peaceful. It throbbed with unspoken tension, heavy with a weight they hadn't been prepared to carry. By morning, Naomi had made a decision. She would go back to the place where it all began. Not the hospital records office, not the state archives. She needed something more visceral, something closer to the bone. She needed the truth from someone who had lived it. James noticed the set of her jaw when she came down for coffee. He said nothing at first, only watching her as she moved through the kitchen, robotic in her motions. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Are you all right?" "No," Naomi said simply. "I'm going to Georgia." He blinked. "Georgia?" "To the town I was born in, the one my mother left and never talked about." James looked startled. "Do you think someone there still knows?" "I don't know," she cut in, "but I need to find out." He nodded slowly. "Do you want me to come?" Naomi hesitated, then shook her head. "I need to do this alone." The children were still sleeping, and Leah had not yet come down from her room. Naomi packed light, a single overnight bag in her mother's old leather-bound folder which now contained every document she could find. James walked her to the car, kissed her temple, and watched her pull away without another word. The drive was long and quiet, winding through landscapes that grew more rural the farther she went. Fields stretched out endlessly, dotted with trees and old gas stations. Naomi tried not to think, but thoughts came anyway. What if she was wrong? What if the hospital records were a mistake? What if Leah was just a stranger after all, some strange twist of genetics and fate? But then she remembered the birthmark, and the lullaby, and the way the children had gravitated to Leah without hesitation. By the time she reached the small town of Willowbend, dusk was settling in. The town hadn't changed much since her childhood visits, though she hadn't been back since her mother's funeral 5 years earlier. She found the old street easily, Maple Row. Her mother's childhood home had been sold years ago, but many of the neighbors still lived there, their names unchanged on faded mailboxes. She didn't stop to visit any of them. Instead, she drove directly to the address she'd scribbled down from an online search. a small retirement home nestled between two sprawling oak trees on the outskirts of town. The building was modest but clean. A nurse at the front desk looked up as Naomi approached. "I'm here to see Marlene Wright," Naomi said. The nurse frowned. "She's not had visitors in a long time. Are you family?" "No," Naomi replied, "but I think she might have known mine." The nurse led her down a corridor lined with framed quilts and photographs of the town in sepia tones. They stopped outside a room where the door was slightly ajar. Inside, an elderly woman sat by the window, knitting something Naomi couldn't make out. "She has good days and bad ones," the nurse whispered. "Sometimes she forgets." Naomi nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Marlene Wright looked up slowly, her cloudy eyes narrowing as she took in Naomi's face. For a moment, the two women simply stared at each other. "You look like her," the old woman murmured. "Like who?" "Your mama. Not in the eyes. The eyes are different. But the face, yes." Naomi stepped closer. "Did you work at Willow Bend General Hospital in 1989? Marlene blinked slowly. "I was a nurse, night shift. I worked the maternity wing." Naomi reached into her bag and pulled out the birth record. She unfolded it carefully and placed it on the woman's lap. "Do you remember this?" The old woman stared at it for a long time. Then her hands began to tremble. "Baby A and baby B," she said softly. "Twins. Their mother came in late, nearly dying. She was young, scared, and poor." Naomi's throat tightened. "That was my mother." Marlene nodded. "They told her one baby had died, but that was a lie." Naomi felt the air leave her lungs. "What happened to the other baby?" "She was taken. Not stolen exactly, but taken. There was a woman. Couldn't have children. She worked with someone at the hospital. They made arrangements, quiet ones. They paid the bill, signed some papers. The baby went with her. The mother, she didn't fight. She was too weak, too ashamed." Naomi pressed her hand to her chest, her heart thudding painfully. "Did my mother know she was alive?" "I think she did," Marlene said, "but it was easier to pretend she didn't. She left town not long after, moved north, never looked back." Naomi sat down, her legs no longer able to support her. Her hands trembled in her lap. "Do you know where the other baby went?" Marlene shook her head. "No, that part wasn't documented. It was all off the record." Naomi stared out the window, the sky now streaked with purples and oranges. Her mother had known. All these years she had carried that weight and never said a word. Naomi wanted to scream, to cry, to demand why, but the only person who could answer was gone. She stayed at a motel that night, unable to make the drive back in her current state. Sleep came in fragments, full of strange dreams and memories that weren't hers. She saw herself as a baby, split into two, pulled apart like fabric. She heard a woman sobbing in a hospital bed. She saw another woman with kind eyes carrying a child away, disappearing into a corridor that stretched forever. By morning, Naomi felt raw but resolute. She drove back to the city in silence, her hands tight on the steering wheel. She no longer doubted. She no longer questioned. Leah was her sister. When she arrived home, the house was quiet. James met her at the door, took her bag, and searched her eyes. "You found something," he said. Naomi nodded. "I found everything." Leah was in the kitchen, sitting at the table, sipping tea. She looked up as Naomi entered, and something in her expression shifted. Naomi didn't speak right away. She sat across from her, studied her face, and then reached across the table to take her hand. "I went to Willow Bend," she said. Leah's fingers twitched, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I spoke to a nurse. She was there when we were born. Leah's breath caught. We were twins, Leah. You're my sister. The words hung in the air like a slow-burning candle. Leah didn't respond immediately. She blinked rapidly, her lips parting and closing again, as if trying to speak but unable to form the words. I always wondered, she whispered at last, why I felt misplaced, why I had dreams of places I'd never been. Naomi tightened her grip. Because you weren't misplaced. You were taken, and now you're home. Tears spilled down Leah's cheeks, silent and unrestrained. Naomi stood, walked around the table, and wrapped her arms around the woman who was no longer a stranger. I've spent my whole life believing I was alone, Naomi murmured, but I'm not. Not anymore. In the hallway, James stood quietly, watching. He didn't move, didn't interrupt. He simply turned away, his eyes shining, and gave them the moment they were never allowed to have. Something broken had begun to heal. Something stolen had begun to return. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, for the first time since Leah had arrived, the weight in Naomi's chest began to lift. The next morning began with a stillness unlike any Naomi had ever felt in that house. The air seemed to hum with something invisible but undeniable, a presence, a weight, a certainty, the kind that shifts the soul. She had told Leah everything the night before, and the two had clung to each other in the kitchen as if afraid the truth might slip away. But now, with sunlight streaming through the windows and the children stirring upstairs, Naomi felt the pull of the next step. The past was no longer buried. It had surfaced, fragmented and weathered, and demanded to be seen through to the end. James greeted her quietly when she entered the kitchen. He was at the stove, making scrambled eggs, though his movements were slower than usual. Naomi poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching him. "Did she sleep?" he asked without looking up. Naomi nodded. Eventually, "She okay?" "I think so. We both are." He turned then, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know what to say about any of this." "You don't have to," Naomi replied. "It's not something we can make sense of. It just is." There was a knock at the door before either could say more. Naomi glanced at the clock. It was too early for guests, too late for deliveries. She opened the door to find a courier holding a manila envelope. Delivery for Naomi Harwood. She signed quickly, confused, and opened the envelope on the spot. Inside were copies of her request to the state health department for her original birth documents. She hadn't expected them to respond so soon. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the contents and flipped through the paperwork. There it was again. Her birth certificate. Hospital records. But this time, something new had been included. A handwritten intake form from the hospital's archival department with a small, faded note at the bottom. Twin delivery, Baby A, Naomi Grace. Baby B, unnamed. Transferred to foster custody same day. No official adoption registered. Contact records destroyed in 1993 fire. Naomi stood frozen. Her mind reeled at the date. 1993. That was the year her mother had gone through a breakdown and stopped working. Naomi had always thought it was grief from losing her grandmother, but maybe it had been guilt. Maybe she had finally realized the truth couldn't stay buried. Later that day, Naomi called her family friend, Dr. Carter, a retired physician who had once worked at the same hospital where she had been born. He had attended Naomi's high school graduation and had always taken an interest in her life. She explained what she had discovered, and his voice grew quiet. "I remember something," he said slowly. Back then, it wasn't uncommon for infants to be placed in temporary foster care immediately after birth if the mother was incapacitated or couldn't pay, especially if no one claimed the child within a day or two. But wouldn't there be records? He sighed. There should have been, but that hospital was sloppy in the 80s, poorly funded. And when the fire destroyed part of the archives, a lot of information was lost. Conveniently or not, I'll never know. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, her hand clenched around the receiver. "Can I come see you?" "Of course," he said gently. "I'll find anything I can." That afternoon, she drove across town to his modest home, tucked between sycamore trees that had grown wider and older since she'd last seen them. Dr. Carter was thinner than she remembered, with a beard now completely white, but his mind remained sharp. He welcomed her in with quiet warmth and led her to a sunlit den lined with books. They spent hours sifting through his own boxes of hospital clippings, news articles, and medical reports. Finally, they found a note scribbled in the margin of a logbook he had kept personally. "Neonatal case, 2 infants, maternal distress. One transferred out November 4th, 89. Naomi's breath hitched. That date matched Leah's birthday. "It's her," she whispered. Dr. Carter leaned back and nodded solemnly. "I think you already knew that." Naomi returned home with photocopies of everything. She placed them gently on the dining room table that evening, while James read to the children upstairs. Leah joined her after a moment, sitting across from her with cautious eyes. "There's more," Naomi said. "Your records, your transfer, they were erased, or destroyed, but someone made a note, just enough to confirm it." Leah stared at the documents. "I was never adopted, just passed along." Naomi couldn't speak for a moment. Her throat closed with emotion. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I'm so sorry that you were left behind." Leah reached out and touched her hand. "You didn't do it." "No, but she did, and she never told me, not once. She might have thought it was for the best." "Does that make it right?" Naomi whispered. Leah's gaze was soft, unreadable. "I don't know." Naomi stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden. The sky was bruising with twilight, and wind stirred the leaves in gentle, restless waves. "I can't stop thinking about the years we lost," she said. "The birthdays, the stories, the sleepovers. We should have had all of that. And yet," Leah said behind her, "we're here now, somehow." Naomi turned back to her, her eyes filled with both pain and wonder. "Do you believe in fate?" "I didn't," Leah said, "not until I rang your doorbell." The next few days unfolded with a delicate rhythm. The children, sensing the change, began calling Leah Auntie without being told. Sophia asked if she could braid Leah's hair, and Miles wanted her to read bedtime stories. James, still quiet, was more present, more patient, as though trying to rebuild his understanding of the world piece by piece. But Naomi felt a storm still brewing. Not the kind outside, but one that came from knowing that a story like this didn't end just because it had been told. There were consequences. There were institutions involved, records falsified, names changed, children lost in paperwork. One evening, James brought her a manila folder. "What's this?" she asked. "I started looking into the agency that sent Leah." Her stomach twisted. "Why?" "Because something still doesn't sit right with me. Agencies don't just coincidentally assign someone to a family where she's an identical match to the employer. That's not luck. That's design." Naomi sat down, unfolding the documents. There were articles clipped from online forums, legal filings, even a complaint lodged by a former employee. Words leapt from the pages. Identity mismatch, falsified employment history, manipulated placements, quiet investigations. James pointed to a line in one report. This woman here, she was sent to work as a caretaker for a family. Turned out she was the biological daughter the mother had given up for adoption 30 years earlier. Different agency, but same network. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. So this could have been orchestrated? James nodded. I don't think they knew everything, but they knew enough. Enough to match profiles to make connections where people wouldn't ask questions. Naomi sat back in her chair, stunned. The idea that their lives had been manipulated without consent, that Leah had been sent to them not by accident but by quiet calculation, it chilled her. We have to do something, she said. James agreed. We will. But first, we talked to Leah. They brought her into the living room, the children upstairs, and the house dimly lit in the warmth of evening. We think you were found on purpose, Naomi said. Leah's face darkened. What do you mean? James explained, showing her the documents. Leah read silently, then looked up with wide, stunned eyes. I applied for dozens of jobs, she said. None of them answered me, except one. This one. You were chosen, Naomi said, because they knew, or at least suspected. And they sent me anyway, Leah said, voice cracking, like it was some kind of experiment. Like it was nothing, Naomi replied bitterly. Leah stood, crossed the room, and wrapped her arms around herself. I always thought I didn't belong anywhere. And now that I do, it turns out I was pushed into it. You do belong, Naomi said firmly, no matter how it happened. Leah turned slowly, her eyes glistening. Then help me. Help me make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. And in that moment, the fear and betrayal gave way to purpose. Naomi saw it clearly now. This wasn't just about their past. It was about the future. About making sure that no child disappeared into paperwork again. About taking back control of their narrative. Together, they began to plan. Not just how to expose the agency, but how to help others like them. They would dig deeper, file complaints, speak publicly. They would take what had been taken from them and build something lasting. As Naomi tucked her children into bed that night, she looked down at their sleepy faces and thought of all the days they might have grown up without ever knowing Leah. A tear slipped down her cheek as she kissed each of them good night. Downstairs, Leah was waiting with tea, a look of quiet strength on her face. Naomi smiled. For the first time, it felt real. Not a reflection, not a shadow, but a sister. Home. The days after their revelation passed like the gentle falling of leaves, slow and quiet, yet deeply transformative. Naomi had always believed that truth, no matter how painful, had the power to free. But nothing in her life had prepared her for the strange stillness that came once the truth was known. No earthquake followed, no collapse of the world she had built. Instead, it was as if a new room had opened within her house, a place that had always existed, locked behind a door she hadn't known was there. And inside that room stood Leah, no longer a stranger, not merely a guest, but someone whose very presence shifted the weight of the home, realigned its center. The children had adjusted faster than the adults. Sophia called her Auntie Leah with such ease that it sometimes made Naomi pause. The girl braided Leah's hair in the mornings, told her school stories at night, and clung to her like a second mother. Miles followed her from room to room, begged her to read his favorite books, and took to sitting beside her whenever he felt overwhelmed. James watched them all from a quiet distance, a protective calm in his eyes, though Naomi noticed the way he occasionally touched her shoulder a little longer, or reached for her hand when she seemed lost in thought. But Leah herself remained the most changed. In the beginning, she was tentative, grateful, overwhelmed, unsure of where to step or how to exist in a space that had once been foreign and was now hers by blood. Yet something in her had begun to bloom. She no longer hesitated when speaking. She laughed more freely. Her smile lingered longer. It wasn't that she had become someone new, but that the shadow that had followed her for as long as she could remember had begun to lift. Still, Naomi knew they weren't finished. They had found each other, yes, but that discovery had been orchestrated, sent by an agency with a history of manipulation, matched like puzzle pieces not for healing, but for efficiency. There was a part of Naomi that refused to let that go unchallenged. And so, in the evenings, after the children were asleep and the dishes done, the sisters would sit at the kitchen table surrounded by papers and names and documents. They began building a case. They researched the network of agencies that had fed into the one Leah had come through. They traced connections, recorded interviews, filed formal complaints. Leah was relentless. Naomi watched her with admiration as she wrote letters, made phone calls, pieced together the fragments of other stories like hers. Stories of children misplaced, adopted without record, shifted across borders with falsified documents. She had found her voice, and it was strong, and Naomi, for her part, stood by her, not just as a sibling, but as an anchor. Someone who could no longer claim innocence, and who had no interest in standing silently on the sidelines of someone else's pain. James supported them both. He offered his legal expertise, helping draft formal correspondence and navigate the dense bureaucracy of the state's family services. Though he was still haunted by the way Leah had entered their lives, he was no longer distant. He had chosen to stand with them, and in doing so, he found a role that grounded him. But, despite the strength they now drew from one another, Naomi could not deny that there were moments when the cracks in her soul ached. She had lived nearly 4 decades believing she was whole, that her life, though imperfect, was complete, and now she knew that from her very first breath, something had been missing. A sister, a second heartbeat, someone who should have been there for every scraped knee, every whispered secret, every birthday candle. Naomi mourned not only for Leah, but for herself, for the girl who had grown up not knowing there was someone else out there carrying the same birthmark, the same blood, the same echo of memory. One morning, Naomi found herself staring at an old photo on her dresser. It was a picture of her as a toddler, sitting on her mother's lap, both of them smiling. For years, she had thought of it as a perfect moment. Now, it felt like a lie. Not because the smile was false, but because there should have been 2 little girls in that picture. 2 daughters, not one. And her mother, how could she have hidden this for so long? Naomi still remembered the last time she had spoken to her mother before she passed. It had been brief, strained. Her mother had refused to talk about the past, dismissing questions with tired laughter and weary eyes. Naomi had assumed it was grief or pride, or perhaps the creeping confusion of age. But now she saw it differently. It had been shame, her mother had known, and she had chosen silence. That evening, Naomi sat with Leah in the garden. The late spring air was warm, fragrant with lavender and mint. They had planted the herbs together the previous weekend, and the garden had become their shared sanctuary. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" Naomi asked. Leah looked up from the pruning shears in her lap. "All the time." Naomi nodded. I keep wondering what our childhood would have looked like. Would we have fought, played dress-up together, had secrets only we knew? I think about it too, Leah said, but not in the way you might think. I don't feel angry that we missed it. I feel grateful that we still found each other. Naomi turned to her. After everything, after what was taken from you, you're not angry? Leah smiled softly. I was, for a long time, but I learned that anger never stayed warm. It just made me colder. And then I came here and I saw you. And I felt not cheated, just unfinished, like a book missing the last chapter. Now I have it. That's enough. Naomi's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and took her sister's hand, holding it tightly between her own. Later that night, the doorbell rang. It was nearly 9, and Naomi frowned as she wiped her hands and walked to the door. James followed, curious. When she opened it, a courier stood outside holding a small box and an envelope. "Delivery for Miss Leah Morris," he said. Naomi took it, puzzled. "She's not expecting anything." The courier simply nodded, turned, and left. Leah came downstairs as Naomi was placing the package on the kitchen table. Her expression froze when she saw it. "I don't understand," Naomi said. "It's addressed to you." Leah picked up the envelope first. She opened it slowly, carefully unfolding the letter inside. As she read, her face changed. Surprise, confusion, and then something else entirely. She handed the letter to Naomi with trembling fingers. It was from a law firm. The letter explained that during a recent audit of closed estate files, Leah's name had appeared on a dormant inheritance file. Her former employer, a wealthy widow named Eleanor Bass, had passed away the previous year. Unbeknownst to Leah, she had named her as a beneficiary, bequeathing to her a modest house in the city and a trust fund worth nearly $120,000. Naomi stared at the paper, her mouth dry. "She never told me," Leah whispered. "I worked for her for 3 years. She was kind, but distant. I never imagined—" James sat down slowly, reading the letter again. "It's legitimate," he said. "The law firm is real. The deed is enclosed." Leah opened the box. Inside was a set of house keys, a small golden plaque engraved with her name, and a note written in fine script. "You were the daughter I never had. May this give you the home you always deserved." Tears slipped silently down Leah's cheeks. Naomi stood beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You have a home here?" Naomi said gently. "I know," Leah replied, "but now I have something that's mine, too." They cried together, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming grace of it all. Leah had come into their lives as a servant. She had been shuffled, lost, denied, and now she had been given a gift that was hers alone, not as someone's sister or employee, but as herself. That night, the house buzzed with a quiet joy. The children clapped when they were told the news. James brought out a bottle of wine. Naomi cooked Leah's favorite dish. And as they sat around the table, laughter filling the space that had once been tight with fear, Naomi looked around and realized that something had shifted in her. She was no longer afraid of what had been lost. She was grateful for what had been found. In the days following the delivery of the letter, the house seemed to breathe differently. Something had expanded inside its walls, as if the truth and grace of the moment had reached into the beams and corners and rewired the place from within. The kitchen felt warmer, the hallways brighter. Even the air carried a quieter tone, no longer charged with suspicion or fear, but saturated with a sense of something deeply earned. Peace. Leah walked differently now. There was a certain rhythm to her step, a lightness that hadn't been there before. It wasn't wealth that changed her, though the inheritance had stunned her to the core, but the confirmation that someone in this world had seen her, had valued her not for what she could clean or carry, not for her quietness or patience, but for who she was, for the girl she had been, the woman she had become. The golden plaque bearing her name, now sitting on the mantel next to the children's framed artwork, seemed to tell a story of redemption that didn't need many words. Naomi found herself watching her sister with an unfamiliar kind of awe. She had known women who had clawed their way through injustice, who had fought for their place at the table. But Leah was different. Leah had been forgotten by systems, erased from paperwork, passed from home to home like something borrowed and never returned. And yet, she had emerged with grace, not bitterness. She had been forced into silence, and now she was speaking, not with a shout, but with the quiet conviction of someone who had nothing left to prove. The house Leah inherited sat on a narrow street nestled between overgrown hedges and wrought iron fences, the kind of place people passed without noticing. It had once belonged to Eleanor Bass, a reclusive widow whose name Naomi vaguely remembered from an article about charitable endowments. The deed confirmed everything. The house, fully paid off, the trust fund managed by a reputable firm, and a letter from the late Eleanor herself, handwritten in shaky cursive, tucked into the back of a black leather folder. "You made me feel seen," it said. "You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. How to listen, how to laugh, how to feel useful again. I may not have had children, but I hope this makes up for what I couldn't give you while I was alive." Leah read the letter aloud in Naomi's living room the day after the delivery arrived. When she finished, she folded it slowly and held it to her chest. James sat silently, his arm draped across the back of the couch. Naomi sat opposite her sister, holding a mug of untouched tea, her thoughts flickering in every direction. "What will you do?" she asked finally. Leah was quiet for a moment. "I want to keep it, but not to live alone. I don't want to go back to living like that." "You don't have to," Naomi said quickly, almost too quickly. "I know." Leah smiled gently. "I want to make it something more. Something for people like us." "Us?" "People who've been forgotten, moved around, hidden. The ones who slipped through paperwork, who never got their names on a plaque." Naomi leaned forward. "Like a shelter?" Leah shook her head. "No, not exactly. A place where people can breathe, rest, rebuild, maybe learn a skill, meet others. Something small, but steady." James spoke for the first time. "You could apply for nonprofit status. With the inheritance, you'd qualify. And I can help with the legal side." Leah nodded slowly, the idea unfolding in her mind. "It can't be named after Eleanor. Or maybe," she looked up at Naomi, "maybe after our mother." Naomi flinched just slightly. "Our mother who never told us we existed?" Leah didn't waver. "She made mistakes, terrible ones, but if not for her, I wouldn't have your face, your voice, your stubbornness." Naomi chuckled despite herself. "Stubborn?" Leah arched a brow. "You call it conviction." The decision was made that evening. They would turn the house into a sanctuary, not just for women, though that would be the core, but for anyone displaced, anyone who had been shuffled through systems and institutions, unseen. They would name it the Grace House, a nod to Leah's original name, the one left behind on a crumpled note in a hospital bassinet. Word spread quickly. At first, just among friends and neighbors, then through Naomi's social media, where she shared their story in small, careful pieces. Not the sensational version, the one that would have turned heads and drawn out headlines, but the quiet truth. A woman who opened her door and found her sister. A family reshaped by an accident that was never an accident. A home inherited not by bloodline, but by love and grace. The response was overwhelming. Donations came from strangers. Messages arrived from people who had never found their siblings but still hoped. Others wrote to say they had given up looking for lost parents or had children stolen by circumstance and found comfort in knowing stories like this still existed. But not everyone was pleased. 3 weeks after the announcement of the Grace House, Naomi received a call from James, his voice low and tense. "I just heard from a contact in state licensing," he said. "The agency that sent Leah, they've been shut down." "What?" Naomi stood in the middle of the garden, phone pressed tightly to her ear. "There was an investigation launched after you filed that complaint, but apparently they'd already been flagged in other states. Illegal placements, forged backgrounds. Someone leaked it to the press." Naomi's blood ran cold. "Do they know we're involved?" James hesitated. "Not officially, but our story is public now. They could connect the dots." That evening, Naomi and Leah sat in the den, documents spread around them. James joined them with a file in hand. "There's a reporter who wants to interview us," he said. "She's been covering adoption fraud cases for years." Leah leaned back. "Do you trust her?" "I do," he replied. "But we need to be careful. They'll want emotion. They'll want something they can turn into a headline." "I'm not interested in being a headline," Leah said calmly. "I want the truth, just the truth." Naomi met her gaze. "We tell our story, on our terms, and if they twist it, we walk away." The interview was set for the following week. A modest feature in a reputable magazine, nothing flashy. Leah sat on the couch, her posture strong but relaxed. Naomi sat beside her. The journalist asked careful questions. About childhood, about the day they met, about the discovery of their connection, and the unfolding truth. The article was published under the title "The House That Found Her." It was elegant, restrained, and devastating in its quiet power. Photos of the sisters standing outside the Grace House, arms around each other, appeared on newsstands across the state. Requests for interviews followed, book deals, podcast invitations, but Naomi and Leah turned them all down. They hadn't done this for attention. They had done it because something sacred had been broken, and now at last was being rebuilt. By summer, the Grace House opened its doors. The first resident was a young woman named Tasha, who had aged out of the foster system and had nowhere else to go. Then came a mother and child escaping an abusive home. A teenager who had run from a failed adoption. Each brought their own brokenness. Each found shelter not just in a building, but in the people who ran it. Naomi and Leah worked side by side, cooking meals, organizing donations, painting walls. James handled the legal paperwork, the funding applications. The children brought life to the place, their laughter echoing down the halls as they played tag or drew chalk murals in the driveway. One evening, after the residents had gone to sleep and the kitchen lights dimmed, Naomi stood alone on the back porch of the house that was no longer just Leah's. It had become theirs. She watched the moon rise above the rooftops, its light catching on the wind chimes that had once belonged to Eleanor. Leah joined her, leaning against the rail. "I used to think I didn't belong anywhere," she said softly. "Now I feel like I belong in more than one place." Naomi nodded. "You belong everywhere you're loved." The wind picked up gently, rustling the leaves. The house behind them glowed with warm light. And in that moment, Naomi felt something she hadn't dared to believe in for a long time. Not just closure, not just purpose, but the rare, holy feeling of home restored. Whatever had been taken from them at birth had not vanished. It had simply waited. And now it had come back whole. By the end of summer, the Grace house had grown beyond even Naomi and Leah's quietest hopes. What had begun as a tribute, a miracle, a reclamation of dignity and home, had evolved into something living. Not just a shelter, not just a space with walls and furniture and smiling volunteers, but a haven stitched together with story and survival. It had taken on a soul of its own. It pulsed with the footsteps of women and children who came through its door carrying invisible bruises and left with something like breath in their lungs again. Naomi, who had once viewed charity work with the distant admiration of someone too busy to truly participate, now woke each morning with the call of purpose humming just behind her ribs. And Leah had become the house's center, its quiet heartbeat. The woman who had arrived in their lives with nothing but a duffel bag and an apologetic smile was now the most rooted of them all. It was a strange and humbling reversal. Naomi had spent her life believing she was the foundation, the anchor, and the one who knew who she was. But it turned out that knowing yourself and knowing your whole story were two very different things. Leah had never known hers, yet now, in the curve of her voice and the way she moved through the house with ease, she seemed not only sure of her place, but determined to build one for others. Naomi had always prided herself on control, clarity, excellence, but there was something in her sister's quiet resilience that humbled her daily. Leah didn't just speak hope, she made space for it. And Naomi, for the first time, didn't need to lead. She was content to walk beside. Their bond had grown not with intensity, but with depth. There were no declarations, no dramatic breakthroughs, just the steady layering of shared days. Teaching Miles how to ride a bike in the back lot, curling Sophia's hair for school picture day, falling asleep on the couch during late-night planning meetings, arguing over grocery lists and nonprofit bylaws, learning the rhythm of each other's silences, the ordinary dailiness of family. It was, Naomi often thought, the truest miracle of all. Not that they had found each other, but that they had managed to become something real in the process. James had found his own kind of peace as well. He no longer moved through the days with the strained caution of a man trying to understand something unexplainable. He had watched Leah integrate into their lives not like a guest, but like someone who had always been meant to be there. He had made room without ever making a show of it. He handled the finances, the legal structure, the scheduling. He laughed more now. He kissed Naomi's cheek more frequently, and when their eyes met across the room, there was a kind of knowing there, of everything they'd weathered, everything they still might. Naomi had once feared that Leah's presence would create distance between them. Instead, it had drawn them closer in the most unexpected way, through mutual humility. They had been wrong, both of them, and instead of destroying them, the truth had made them gentler. The children flourished. Sophia, who had always been observant, bloomed into a thoughtful, curious, and surprisingly protective presence among the younger children at Grace House. She often sat with them during story time or helped organize crayons into neat, color-coded bins. Miles was less orderly, more chaotic in his joy, but he had grown more affectionate, more willing to listen. He no longer cried when Naomi left the room. He simply turned to Leah instead. One evening in early October, as the light began to sharpen with the promise of coming winter, The family gathered on the porch after dinner. The air smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon from the pie Leah had baked earlier. The kids were bundled in sweatshirts, Naomi in a shawl. Leah sat beside her hands wrapped around a warm mug. "I've been thinking," Leah said softly. "I want to stay." Naomi turned to her. "At Grace House?" Leah nodded. "Not just work here, live here, with you, and with all of it." Naomi's throat tightened. "Even with the new place?" "The house is beautiful," Leah said, "and I'm grateful for it. But it feels like the past. Grace House feels like the future." Naomi placed her hand over her sister's. "Then it's yours. Ours. However you want it." Later that night, after the children had gone to bed and James had gone upstairs to read, Naomi stood in the hallway outside the guest room, the room Leah had first entered months ago with her bag and her shaking smile. It had become something else now. Not just a room, not just a space with a bed and a dresser. It had become sacred in its transformation. A place where a woman had stepped through a door and, in doing so, returned to her own story. Naomi entered quietly. On the dresser sat a small framed photo, one of her and Leah with the children, arms slung around each other, laughing so hard they were nearly blurred. Beside it was the golden plaque from Eleanor, polished to a shine. She turned and found Leah standing in the doorway. "I was thinking about our mother today," Leah said. Naomi said nothing, just waited. "She died never telling us, never bringing us together, but I don't hate her for it." Naomi nodded slowly. "Neither do I. I wish she had believed we could survive the truth." "She didn't trust it," Leah said. "But we do." Naomi stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her sister. They stood there like that for a long time. Two women, once divided by silence, now held together by something stronger. Weeks passed, then months. The trees shed their leaves and the air turned cold and sharp. Grace House filled and emptied, the rhythm of it as steady as breath. They celebrated holidays together. Thanksgiving with too much food and not enough chairs, Christmas with handmade decorations and stories told by firelight. Naomi and Leah began speaking at local churches, then libraries, then community centers. Not about trauma or spectacle, but about forgiveness, about identity, about what it means to reclaim the story someone else tried to write for you. They never claimed to have all the answers. They simply told the truth. It was enough. On a quiet Saturday in January, Naomi sat on the floor of her living room, organizing old files. She was sorting through outdated paperwork, school photos, receipts, when she came across the original envelope that had started it all. The birth record marked Baby A, the intake sheet with the missing name, the photograph with her mother's handwriting. She held it all in her hands and felt again the weight of the mystery that had unraveled into meaning. She turned the photo over and read the familiar words, "My beautiful girl, A." For the first time, she didn't feel a pang. She didn't feel the ghost of what had been hidden. She smiled, because now she understood what had been meant all along, that A had never stood alone. She placed the photo into a new folder marked with both their names, Naomi and Leah, and filed it beside the children's schoolwork, not as evidence, not as proof, but as belonging. That night, Naomi sat at the kitchen table writing a letter, not for anyone official, just for herself, for her children, perhaps one day, for the mirror she now carried within. She wrote about a doorbell, about a woman with her face, about a house that became more than a house, about a past that was not forgiven easily, but embraced anyway, about how love is not born of perfection, but persistence. She wrote until her hand ached. And when she was finished, She folded the pages, sealed them in an envelope, and placed them inside the hollow of an old book. In the morning, she would begin again, make breakfast, kiss James, pack lunches, answer emails, hold meetings, fold laundry. But tonight, she let herself be still. Let the silence be full. Let the mirror hold. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for stories that will stay with you. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them.